the way, the truth, and the life, says the Lord. No one can come to the Father except through me. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus and his disciples left for the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he put this question to his disciples: "Who do people say I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist," they said. "Others, Elijah. Others again, one of the prophets." "But you," he said, "who do you say I am?" Peter spoke up and said to him, "You are the Christ." And he gave them strict orders not to tell anybody about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man was destined to suffer grievously, to be rejected by the elders and chief priests and the scribes, and to be put to death, and after 3 days to rise again. And he said all this quite openly. Then, taking him aside, Peter started to remonstrate with him. But, turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said to him, "Get behind me, Satan, because the way you think is not God's way, but man's." He called the people and his disciples to him and said, "If anyone wants to be a follower of mine, let him renounce himself and take up his cross and follow me. For anyone who wants to save his life will lose it. But anyone who loses his life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." The Gospel of the Lord. Do you know, things are not always what they seem. Very often we perceive something as being true only to discover that it's not quite what we thought it was. Let me try an experiment with you. Put your hands up, everyone who in this picture can see a beautiful young lady. Okay, if you put your hands up, about half the church put their hands up. Now put your hands up if you can see an old woman. About half the church. So half of you perceived a young lady, half of you perceived an old lady. And the truth is, they were both. Now let me try another experiment with you. And this time, I want you to point. You will see a grey bar at the center of that picture. I want you to point in the direction where you think that the grey bar is darkest. Okay, everyone is pointing to their right. You're wrong. In fact, the grey bar is a constant all the way through. What has changed is the background. The background's colour is variable, and that makes your eye think that the grey bar is changing. In fact, the grey bar stays the same. Now here's the last and final experiment. Would you walk down this path? You know, that was bad workmanship. There's a big hole there in the ground. But in fact, it's a trick of the eye. It's the way the tiles have been painted. In fact, that pathway is perfectly flat. It's just a clever use of art that gives the impression that there's a dent in the floor. Do you know, I would love those tiles for my kitchen. I think it'd be fantastic. And I would put the dip round where the biscuit tin is. Things are not always what they seem. And that's true in the scriptures that we hear. You know, today's gospel passage from chapter 8 of the Gospel of Mark is a turning point in Mark's Gospel. Things are totally different from now on in. You know, up to now, we've been hearing about Jesus and particularly about the miracles that he works. And the crowds are really beginning to follow him now. They're amazed at what he does, the healings, the making people well again, freeing people from their afflictions. And they are absolutely amazed at him. You know, last week's gospel finished with the words, their admiration of him was unbounded. You know, he's a miracle worker. Everyone wants to be at Jesus' side. They want to come and to be healed. That's why they admire him so much. But there is also another thing going on in the gospel, and we hear it in the gospel today. Very often when Jesus heals someone, he says to them, yeah, but don't tell anyone about this. You know, we hear Peter today in response to his question, who do you say I am? Peter says, you are the Christ. And what does Jesus say? Do not tell anyone. And what's going on here is that Jesus doesn't want anybody to know that he can do miracles. Is that Jesus is too shy to be known as the Christ? Why is he instructing them not to tell anyone? Well, the answer is because you've misunderstood who I am. That's the answer. You know, the crowds are following Jesus because he's a great miracle worker, and they want more of the same. You know, Peter understands that Jesus is the Christ. But guess what? He's not going to be the kind of Christ that Peter wants or expects. You know, that's why we get into this awkward situation with Peter and Jesus. When Jesus turns to Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. Because the way you're thinking is not God's way, but man's way. So what's going on here? What is it that Jesus is trying to teach us about himself? So that when we ask ourselves the question, who is Jesus to me? Then we'll come to the right answer. You know, it's an important question that each and every single one of us should ask ourselves. Imagine today Jesus saying to you, who do you say I am? Who am I to you? You know, it might be that we say, well, you are a great healer, you know, you've cured me of some illnesses, or you're a great protector, you're a great guide, you know, you're my safety net, you're my insurance policy against what God might do to me. We can have lots of answers to that question, but it's really important that we explore our answer. Because that answer affects how you relate to Christ. You know, the word, you are the Christ, is important in the scriptures. You know, the Hebrew word is Messiah, and the Greek translation is Christ. But those words mean the anointed one. And we find that title is applied to Jesus 529 times in the New Testament. So this title is important. The authors of the New Testament use it time and time and time again. But what would a first century Palestinian Jew understand by the title Christ or Messiah? Well, to understand it, we would need to go back into the Old Testament and look at those who are described as being the anointed ones. And invariably, They are kings. They are the ones chosen by God to lead his people Israel. And the two kind of supreme examples of that are King David and King Solomon. You know, King David is really the kingdom of Israel at its peak. You know, it was a divided land, and it was King David that brought it all together and made it one nation, the way God intended. King David did that, the anointed one of God, chosen especially by God. Remember, David was just a shepherd. His other brothers were more qualified to be a king than David was, yet God chose David and anointed him as the chosen one. And King David not only united the nation, he drove out all of Israel's enemies from his territory. He made the kingdom united. And his son Solomon, he reigned over a period of great economic growth for Israel, that the people were better off in King Solomon's time, the anointed one of God. So when a first century Jew was thinking of Christ, the anointed one, they would automatically think of these great kings chosen by God. The other anointed ones in the scripture tended to be priests, religious people, but they wielded power within their community. And so, in answer to that question, who do people say I am and who do you say I am, when Peter says, you are the Christ, he has a very specific understanding of what a Christ is. A Christ is one who comes with great authority and great power. You know, Jesus has authority. We hear at the beginning of Mark's Gospel that he taught with authority, unlike the scribes and the Pharisees. But his authority is of a different order from what we mean by authority. And so for Peter, when he says, you are the Christ, Peter has an understanding that Jesus is the anointed one of God who comes with great power, and he's going to do a couple of things, but starting off with kicking the Romans out of the Holy Land. That's what Peter thinks that Jesus is going to do. He's going to kick these Romans out. He's going to be a great political power leader. You know, when Jesus says to those whom he healed, don't tell anyone, it's because he doesn't want them to think that he's just a miracle worker. He's not a miracle worker. He is doing something completely different. He's turning on its head the notion of the power that the Christ has. Christ's power is of a different order. And so he poses the question, who do you say I am? Let's explore how you understand me. Is your answer to that question, I'm a miracle worker? You've misunderstood me. Is your answer to that question, you are the Christ, the powerful one who's going to kick the Romans out of the Holy Land? You've misunderstood me. That's not who I am. I am something different. And so he goes on to describe his Christship, what that means. And his Christship is about the one who is going to suffer and grievously. He's going to be rejected by the chief priests and the elders. His Christship is of a different order. Now, we can understand now why Peter started to remonstrate with Jesus. You know, we have to have sympathy for that. Jesus has just wrecked his worldview. He's been waiting, like the people of Israel, all of his life for this great Messiah. And Jesus offered that hope to Peter. And Jesus has just wrecked it. He said to Peter, that's not the kind of Messiah I am. I'm going to suffer grievously and be put to death. And he throws in the line, and on the third day I will rise again. But, how would Peter understand that? So Peter's worldview has just been destroyed. But Jesus goes even further. He says, if you want to be a follower of mine, you must renounce yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Jesus is implying suffering here. And none of us really want to suffer. But he says, not only am I a different kind of Christ, but if you want to be a follower of me, then it's not because I'm a miracle worker. It's not because I'm all-powerful. It's because I have taken up a particular way of believing and behaving, and I invite you to do the same. And so the power that Jesus has is love. From now on in Mark's Gospel, there will be no more miracles. There will be no more big works. There'll be no more big speeches. All that's going to happen from now on in Mark's Gospel is we're going to move towards Calvary. And Calvary is the ultimate expression of God's love for his people. Because on Calvary, what we see is a God who knows that there is suffering in our lives and shares that suffering. Not a God who is distant from us, but a God who suffers alongside us. A God who pours out his life in love to defeat all those things that stop us having life in abundance, sin and death. That a God who empties himself of his Godhead and then his humanity in a total spirit of love. And the reality is, brothers and sisters, that we all know that the path of love also entails suffering. When we love someone, we suffer because of that love. Love is not all suffering. There is great joy, there is great hope, there is great peace in love. But it's also an endurance test. To really love someone means that we'll experience suffering because of that love. There's not a parent here whose family life is scot-free of trouble. It's just part and parcel of what families are. There's not a beautiful body here or out there that never knows decay or pain. It's just part of who we are. Those of you who are lucky enough to be in work, you may love your job. In fact, you may be one of those really lucky people who pinch yourself each day and say, do you know what? They actually pay me to do this. But no matter how much you love your work, it is not without suffering and pain. There's sacrifice, large and small, that has to be made. None of us have been exempt from the feeling of betrayal in friendship. And none of us will be exempt from those people that we love dearly who we will lose through death. With love, there comes suffering. And so what Jesus is saying is that I exemplify that total service of love. That's what my Christship is about. That's what my kingdom is about. It's a kingdom of love. And to demonstrate that, I show the suffering of my love. But then he says to us as his church, if we want to follow, then we must be people of love. And we must understand that that commitment of love will bring sacrifice and pain. Because you cannot have love without having sacrifice.